Hello, I'm Bob Weir with another interview of People in the News in North Texas. My guest today is Kyle Cunningham, lead minister at Bridgeway Church on FM 407 in Copper Canyon. Thank you for being here, Kyle.
Thanks. Good to be here.
If you would please begin by telling our viewers something about your background.
Yeah, so I moved to Texas here about 2 years ago. I'm originally from the West Coast. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, so I am an Oregon duck. I studied English literature at the University of Oregon with a minor in business administration, and it's been great to get to experience Texas and all that it has.
Okay, so to get right to it, what made you decide to do this series called Unraveling Racism?
Yeah, so we're doing this three-part conversation at our church, and really the reason behind it was because I feel that ultimately racial reconciliation is just frankly a biblical value, and I think it's at the heart of the gospel and what Jesus came to teach and to help us to achieve.
And have you had much feedback since you started the series? I mean, positives, negatives?
So whenever you talk about race, you're going to have people having reactions. Overall, I would say there has been quite a bit of response, a lot of it being just really positive, both inside the congregation and from people who've heard about it on social media. People have been positive. Now, there have been definitely some people who have not been so positive. We've had some people on Facebook primarily. I don't know who these people are, but making certain comments and trying to have maybe a negative view of what we're trying to do. And so you're going to see some of that. But overall, I've been encouraged because I think people are excited to have the conversation, and even people in our church are certainly wanting to lean into these issues because we all recognize that they're really important.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you show a lot of courage to do it, just to try it.
Oh, well, thanks.
We'll see if it's something that other pastors around the area might want to do as well. Now, you've said that 8 out of 10 congregations are segregated. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I didn't say that. So actually the National Congregation Study, I think it was in 2015, they did a study and they did find that 80% of congregations were dominated by one race or another, and they define that as having 80% or more people in the congregation basically of one race or ethnic group. So that's where that statistic came from. And why that is, that's a good question. I think that at a certain point and at a certain level, we tend to want to gather together with people of similar backgrounds, whether that's a racial background, ethnic background, cultural background, etc. So there's probably that degree that we are attracted to people like us, and that also includes our churches and our neighborhoods and other places of life.
Well, how about the congregational makeup? The congregational makeup, does it equate with the racial makeup of the area?
That Bridgeway, you mean?
Yeah, Bridgeway, for example, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say, Bridgeway would definitely be one of those churches, and we're predominantly a white congregation, and so in some ways I think we're representative of Flower Mound and kind of the greater Flower Mound Highland Village area. But for me, I think the more interesting thing is not necessarily does Bridgeway reflect the community, but rather why are particular communities predominantly white or predominantly black or a mixed race community. So why is it that the church, if it is a reflection of the community, why is the community like that? What are some of the forces at play for why we're living together and working together along the lines of race? So it's a more complicated question, but I would say broadly speaking, Bridgeway is probably representative of the Flower Mound area.
And so if the African American population represents something like 12% of the population, and then so if you had 12% representation in a given church that was predominantly white, then that would mean that the church was integrated.
Perhaps. I think it's kind of a matter of how you want to look at integration and whether you want to call something multicultural or multi-ethnic or not. Generally speaking, though, I would look to see is there a significant portion of a congregation that's representative of different racial groups, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, etc. There's obviously many others. So I think it's hard to say, we could assign a particular number or a particular thing to it, but again, I think it's more about looking around and saying, hey, how many perspectives from a cultural and racial perspective are we seeing represented? So again, it's hard to have a particular number around it. Maybe we could agree on that, but I'm not sure what that would be.
All right, suppose that you did something like this. I mean, suppose a white pastor swapped places with a black pastor, and each gave a sermon in the other's church. How would that go over?
Well, I would hope it would go over really well. And actually, so the church, when I grew up in Oregon, we had relationships with a couple of different churches, and predominantly there's one church that was a predominantly black church. And a couple of times a year, we would get together and actually have a combined worship service where both congregations would worship together. We'd have musicians from both congregations, and then every year the pastors would switch off. So one year it was a white pastor, one year it was a black pastor. So that was a really cool thing growing up that we got to participate in. And even in Bridgeway, actually I'm not the founder of the church, but our founder over the years has actually had times where he has intentionally swapped places with pulpits with another black pastor in the community. And again, I think it's just a really exciting thing, and I think it's a great way to help model what we're trying to achieve and why it's important. It's great to hear from a different perspective, different perspectives in general, but a different racial perspective. It's just such a important aspect to understanding what a life of faith looks like from hearing it through a voice that doesn't sound like yours, so to speak.
And yeah, and be interesting to for whites to sometimes go to a black church. Mm-hmm. And blacks go to a white church, so to speak, just to get the feeling of what it's like to be the minority in that particular instance. All right, let me ask you this about that. If people adhere to the principles in the Bible, can they have racist views?
I don't think you can hold to a biblical vision of race and have racist views. I mean, I think the Bible is overwhelmingly clear, in so many ways and in so many places that the kingdom of God is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual reality. And so if you, in practice or in your heart or in your in any other way, try to deny that or to try to relegate someone else by the status of, or by virtue of their race, I don't see how you can maintain a biblical worldview and call yourself a Christian while also holding on to racist views or ideology or practices.
I think, in psychology it's called cognitive dissonance, right?
Yep.
I mean, trying to hold two opposing views in your mind at the same time. I don't see how people can do that very easily, unless they have a troubled way of thinking.
Yeah, but we also have to acknowledge, though, that historically there have been churches in America, particularly in the segregated South, who actually did try to use the Bible as a means and as a justification for segregation. And there's a lot of resources where you can actually see pamphlets distributed by various churches arguing for racism and why racism and slavery and segregation were actually biblical values. And of course, I think that is a perversion of the worst kind, but that is something that we have to acknowledge was a historical reality in church.
So does the Bible mention race relations?
It does. Well, it does. I think especially when you looked at things in a little more detail too. I mean, there's not a section of the Bible that obviously talks about race in the terms that we do as Americans today. But for instance, when you look at the story of Antioch in the book of Acts, right? It's this multicultural, multi-ethnic city, and actually, as you learn about, as you look at the historical evidence, you find that the city was divided among racial lines. And so there were about a dozen of these racial groups represented, and actually it turns out that Christians, these Jews, early Jews, some of them actually wanted to take the good news of Jesus beyond those racial boundaries and actually started to interact with other people because of the gospel.
So do you think there are people who use religion to pose themselves as morally decent?
Yeah, kind of just going to church to maintain appearances.
Sure.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely a prevalent attitude, unfortunately. But there are people who, in the South, there's church is a bigger part of the culture, and so to fit in with your boss or to fit in with your neighborhood, it's very common and very easy to claim some sort of church membership to make sure that I'm identified as an upstanding member of society, which obviously I don't think is the point of church and religion, but some people certainly use it for that.
Yeah. I would say that's true also. And all right, so we're coming to a close. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I just want to say thanks for being here, and I would also say if if you're a person of faith, I would just encourage you to be a part of this conversation in your own church, or to be bringing this up in your communities. I think this is a conversation that's largely not being had, particularly in kind of evangelical America. And so I would say, be a part of having the conversation. Join a church that is committed to racial reconciliation. And again, I'm just excited to be here. I appreciate you giving me a few minutes of your time.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing, Kyle, and your efforts toward racial harmony. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, and thank you for watching.